There are many eras of cars. The brass era had steam engines, the development of the gasoline engine, and early automobiles from 1896 to 1915. There was the post-war era in the 1950s, which gave us the Cadillac tail fin and the modern driving feel. We are currently experiencing the hybrid and electrification era, which is still going on today. But in my opinion, there is one era that is more significant than the others, an era of huge changes in a single decade. That, my friends, would be the Malaise era. Traditionally considered from 1973 to 1983, let's talk about what caused it and what has changed since. Following the end of the Second World War, America was living high on the hog. We had money, we had freedom, and technology was booming. Although Germany was condemned for its actions, there were a few good ideas that came out after the war. One of which was Germany's Autobahn, a strip of high-speed road that helped motorists cross the country with ease, stimulating the economy of smaller communities. It also had huge military benefits, making supply chains easily accessible. Us Americans thought that this was a pretty good idea, so we built our own. This was mostly thanks to Dwight D. Eisenhower. He signed the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, which set out to build 41,000 miles of highway with the help of $25 billion. This act connected clusters of pre-established interstates, allowing cross-country travel to be easier than ever. As highways became better and better, our cars got better suited for the new, longer trips. Cars in the 1960s were radical and free. We got hot cars like the Ford Mustang and the Pontiac GTO. We landed on the moon, and every astronaut was in a Corvette. However, with the faster cars came some consequences. Car accident deaths began to skyrocket in the 1960s. Cars had very few safety features on them at the time, and even fewer were legally mandated because there was no specific group calling the shots. Yearly motor vehicle deaths climbed from 36,000 a year in 1960 to 54,000 in 1969. That is a worrying increase. The public started to demand something change. Ralph Nader gained fame in 1964 with his publishing of Unsafe at Any Speed, which was essentially an open letter to the auto manufacturers about their unsafe vehicles. 2 years later, the government passed the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act, which gave the government the authority to standardize vehicles and road safety. Right off the bat in 1968, seatbelts became mandatory in all passenger vehicles. While it was left to the individual state if they would require you to wear said seatbelts, at least all cars had them. Among other laws, the act led to the creation of the NHTSA in 1970. Something else started happening in this era too. Japan had finally recovered enough to start producing cars. While this is a topic for its own video, the short of it is that Japan hit the ground running after the Second World War. With a new lease on life, tons of companies started producing mopeds, motorcycles, and later cars to mobilize Japanese citizens. These cars quickly became popular, so exports began. Toyota sold their first car in the United States in 1957, marking the first Japanese car ever sold here. Datsun came in 1959, Subaru in 1968, Honda in 1969, and Mazda in 1970. While offering an alternative to large cars, the Japanese brands didn't gain much following at first because the general population didn't see much benefit. We had all the gas we wanted, and it was cheap. Our cars were American built, not built by quote, the enemy, as some people still viewed Japan back in that era. In 1968, Toyota released the Corolla in the United States, signifying the first Japanese car sold in the US that was designed specifically for us, and not just a rehash of a Japanese domestic car. At the time, no one really batted an eye at these little cars, but little did we know that in the next decade, they would become more important than we ever thought. The decade started with the NHTSA creating more and more regulations for vehicle safety. For instance, in September of 1972, 5-mile-an-hour bumpers were required. This meant that a car must be able to withstand hitting a barrier at 5 miles an hour without causing any harm to the headlights, fuel system, or other safety features. This was the first big blow to automotive design. Where cars of the 50s and 60s were full of expression, they now had to account for chunky bumpers and receded headlights. Imported cars had to follow these rules too, which made tons of European models ineligible for import unless the companies wanted to develop new bumpers. Most of them did, but for the American market only. Today, many classic car owners swap to the less gaudy European bumpers on their vintage machines. Motor vehicle fatalities began to stay stagnant and then drop, just like they wanted. This would have been a steady change in the auto industry and wouldn't have had any major impact on cars since they had a while to adapt to the new rules. But then, something came out of right field. (1973) is the year when talking about the Malaise era. The United States government, unrelated to cars, sent supplies to the newly formed Israeli military during the Yom Kippur War. Israel was formed after World War II. This angered the surrounding nations, which is why Israel has been in conflict almost as long as it has been a country. These neighboring countries got mad that the US was helping Israel, so they placed embargoes on their exports to the United States. This meant that we could no longer get oil from them, which was one of our biggest suppliers at the time. Stateside, we felt the effects immediately. Gas shortages crossed the nation. People were waiting hours or even days to fill up their tank. Our economy plummeted. While this was felt worldwide, the oil crisis was the first sucker punch to the mouth for our auto industry. Europe and Japan had always had a focus on small, efficient engines. We did not. 5, 6, 7, and 8-liter engines were common here in the US, and not a single care in the world was given to fuel economy. Nearly overnight, fuel economy became the most important part of a car. It hurt our pride and ego more than anything, showing us that good things can and will come to an end. And for now, our automotive tech went from years ahead to decades behind. We were officially in the Malaise era. When the embargoes ended in 1974, the mood was permanently changed. Energy departments began pushing for conservation. A 55-mile-an-hour speed limit was mandated across the country. And then came the cafe standards. While most cafes are lovely spots for coffee and lukewarm fries, this cafe was less fun. CAFE stands for Corporate Average Fuel Economy, which was passed by Congress in 1975. The new standard required manufacturers to achieve an average fuel economy across the range of their vehicles. Also, immediately, catalytic converters started to appear on cars, although the law wouldn't take effect until 1978, requiring 18 miles per gallon for passenger cars. Light trucks weren't required to comply until 1979, which gave us the short-lived Little Red Express from Dodge. Since no emissions were required for trucks, the Dodge Little Red Express was technically technically the fastest American-made vehicle of 1978. This requirement jumped up 2 miles per gallon every year until 1984, where some restrictions were walked back slightly. But let's not forget about the safety. Even more bumper and pedestrian safety laws were put in place, requiring crash tests of all new cars. This also pushed forward alternative engine designs that were pioneered the decade before. Many companies began experimenting with the rotary engine, like Chevy with the Corvette, seen here in the National Corvette Museum. That's right, Corvette owners, Chevy was going to give it a rotary. The AMC Pacer was also designed to be powered by a Wankel rotary, but both projects were scrapped. Diesel engines were experimented with as well, but they wouldn't come to fruition until the 1980s. But don't worry, we'll talk about that. This time around, Iran was to blame. Iran had a revolution in 1979 to overthrow the current dynasty in their country. This, again, placed stress and embargoes on oil exports, forcing the world into yet another energy crisis. While this didn't hit as hard as the first crisis, it reinforced the need for fuel economy regulations for our cars. It was a sort of told you so moment for the energy conservationists against the auto industry. Fuel economy standards pushed on, but now the public knew that if it happened twice, it could keep happening. This also allowed imported cars to really shine. While Honda, Toyota, Subaru, and Mazda had already been in the country for a little over a decade, their superiority began to shine in the late 70s. In the next decade, they would become the dominant vehicle to purchase, so let's get into the big hair era. All the strict regulations of the 70s came to a head at the beginning of the 80s. VINs were now required, fuel economy regulations continued to rise, and crash safety standards kept getting stricter. All cars were required to highlight 55 miles an hour on their speedometers, with 85 miles an hour being the highest number allowed to be displayed. Seatbelts legally had to be worn. American companies even started trying out diesel engines, as I mentioned earlier, as an alternative to gasoline in hopes of getting better efficiency. And, well, skirting around the CAFE regulations, but, that's between you and me. GM used an Oldsmobile-developed diesel, and Ford used a diesel sourced from BMW. Check out this Lincoln Continental from 1984 with a BMW diesel under the hood. Although it's neat, neither of them caught on, and it particularly blew up in GM's face, forever tarnishing diesel passenger cars in the United States. It seems as though car design was at an all-time low. However, things turned around with the election of Ronald Reagan. We won't get into his entire presidency, that would be many videos, but for the car companies, he was offering a helping hand. In 1982, he relaxed the 5-mile-an-hour bumpers to only 2.5 miles an hour. In 1986, CAFE requirements were paused and actually dropping by 0.5 miles per gallon for the next model year. All of this reopened the lost expression that the Malaise era took away. Cars of the late 80s were fun and full of tech. Thanks to the Ford Taurus and the Ford team for designing it, headlights became molded again. By 1990, the effects of the Malaise era could no longer be seen on the surface, but underneath, we still live with the regulations and restrictions put in place over 50 years ago. According to me, which I'm making this video, so I get to say, there were 3 major effects from the Malaise era. The first was the shakeup of American brands. Before the 1970s, we had never really built small economical cars. We were soaring on eagle's wings. Why would we? Any small car that we did build didn't do really well, like the Nash Metropolitan, or even the Chevy Corvair trying to be economical with its air-cooled engine. It lasted less than a decade. Hence why Volkswagen Bugs were so popular during the oil crisis. So in the late 1970s, the Big Three began building their own version of the imports. The simple recipe of front-wheel drive, 4-cylinder, practical cars. From this, we got cars like the Fiesta, the Citation / Pontiac Phoenix, and even Chrysler made the Charger front-wheel drive, 4-cylinder hatchback. These cars, no matter how charming they were, couldn't compete with the imported cars. So, almost unanimously, the big three made the decision every sore loser faces. If you can't beat them, join them. Chevy shacked up with Toyota to rebadge their Corolla, and later Suzuki and Isuzu for their Geo brand. Ford purchased a huge share in Mazda back in the 70s, but started rebadging the Mazda 121 as the Ford Festiva here. Chrysler joined forces with Mitsubishi, who supplied them with engines for their famous K cars. This 1981 Plymouth Reliant K came with a Mitsubishi badge on the valve cover from the factory. This is how it came off the assembly line floor, a Chrysler with a Mitsubishi badge on it. Also, AMC teamed up with Renault, resulting in cars like the Encore and the Alliance. But that benefited no one, and sales were dull. But they did do a front-wheel drive 4-cylinder. These decisions put pieces in motion for cross-ocean collaborations that we still see today. This also opened the floodgates for hungry entrepreneurs to import the next best economy car. Most famously, Malcolm Bricklin imported the Yugo, a 4-cylinder, front-wheel drive hatchback from Yugoslavia. Another little company came here to give their 4-cylinder, front-wheel drive hatchback a shot. Hyundai with their Excel. Capitalizing on the new trend started after the Malaise era, the little Excel sold well enough to keep the brand in the country. So if you like their new vehicles like the Ioniq cars or the Veloster N, you can thank the Malaise era. The second effect is our focus on fuel economy. Once we started measuring cars by MPG, we never looked back. Every new car is judged by how efficient it is. The Hummer H2 famously had single-digit MPG numbers. That paired with the emissions crisis of the 2000s, and now efficiency is one of the biggest challenges that automakers face today. That was started in the Malaise era. Would we have our EV craze today without the Malaise era? Would hybrids exist? Would hydrogen cars exist? No way to tell, but I certainly feel like they wouldn't. The third effect felt in the Malaise era in the following decades was the rampant sales of Japanese cars. During the Malaise era, American cars fell off their top step, allowing Japanese cars to take the crown for most dependable, efficient daily drivers. Their build quality was better, they got better fuel economy, and they were more affordable than whatever the big three were making. Japanese cars were so popular that Japan themselves began limiting how many vehicles they would export to the US. In order to maintain profit margins, Toyota, Honda, and Nissan formed Lexus, Acura, and Infiniti, respectively. These new upscale brands could charge more for their cars, offsetting the export numbers with more cash flow. Again, the forming of these Japanese luxury brands deserves its own video, but just something I wanted to note. Without the Malaise era, we might not have Lexus, Acura, or Infiniti. The Malaise era wasn't caused by one single thing. It was a melting pot of outside factors that shaped our automotive landscape. Without the highway system, we wouldn't have had such strict safety laws. Without the oil crisis, we wouldn't have had a focus on fuel economy and emissions. Without the pressure from imports, we wouldn't have had a focus on small, economical cars. But altogether, it formed the most radical era of automobiles.